The knock came a full week after the thaw began, when the snow had turned to a slurry of brown water at the base of the riverbanks, and the cottonwoods were dripping like open wounds. No one should have been out this far west. Not now. Not after what the last freeze had done to the land and the people who'd stubbornly clung to it. But the knock came again, firm, slow, and unmistakably human, on a door made not of wood, but of sod, with a latch that hadn't been opened in almost 3 decades. Inside the dugout, everything fell still. The iron pot on the low coals stopped its gentle hiss, the thin smoke rising through the rock chimney curved in place, as if startled, and the woman sitting by the hearth, a wool shawl wrapped over her head like a shroud, did not breathe. She had lived alone here for 27 years. Not hidden, not exactly, but the land was unforgiving enough to keep most folks away without needing fences or words. What man would seek company in a hole dug from the side of a creek bank, half buried in mud, choked with thorn brush and forgotten by every map? Her name was Clara May Branson, and for 27 winters she had cooked, slept, stitched, hauled, scraped, and grown old inside that earth. No preacher had ever come, no doctor, no neighbor except the wind and the vermin and the bones of coyotes she'd found gnawing at the same roots she boiled into stew. For 27 years, she had spoken to no one but herself and the ghosts she allowed to stay. But now, someone was knocking. She didn't move to answer, not yet. She sat rigid, every bone in her spine remembering the weight of past years. Outside, the knock was followed by silence. Then the sound of boots crunching thawed crust. Whoever it was circled once, perhaps trying to understand what this low mound of soil was, or if it were even a dwelling. Clara reached behind her slowly, fingers brushing the haft of the old axe propped near the firewood pile. She never let it dull. Her palms remembered its weight better than the warmth of a hand. The steps moved away, and only then did she rise. The trapdoor at the top of her chimney was still bolted, no smoke to be seen unless you knew exactly where to look. Her dugout was built for survival, not comfort. It had been made when she was 24 and newly widowed, with nothing left but a mule and a single copper pan to her name. That first year had nearly killed her. The second had taught her how to stop caring. By the fifth, she had stopped marking time altogether. Somewhere between the bitter winters and dry summers, she had turned to stone inside. She stepped to the door, didn't open it, just pressed one ear to the damp wood. Nothing, but the world had changed again. And now that someone had come, they might return. The reason Clara vanished all those years ago wasn't spoken about in the county anymore. Folks who remembered either died or forgot willingly. She was the widow of Sheriff Branson, who'd been gunned down in what newspapers called an ambush, but what the town knew was a drunken reckoning behind McDoyle's saloon. Clara had stood alone at his grave, in a wind that tore her veil sideways, clutching a still-healing bruise on her cheek beneath it. A week later, she vanished. Not even the church ladies bothered asking why. People made up stories over time. Some claimed she went east to join cousins. Others whispered she died in the storm of '69, buried under snowpack with all the other poor souls in unmarked graves. Only one boy, now an old man himself, ever swore she still lived out by Crooked Wash, and even he gave up talking about it once his teeth fell out. But Clara lived. She had burrowed herself into the bluff beyond the creek bed with bare hands and a stolen spade. She'd used sod, stone, and stolen fence boards for a door. No windows, just one chimney and a vent no larger than a fist. She wasn't hiding from the world, she was hiding from men. It had started innocently at first, the pastor calling twice to offer her a second chance at companionship. Then the storekeeper, bringing gifts she hadn't asked for. Then 2 brothers from town who offered to build her a cabin on the edge of their property, just so she wouldn't have to be alone. They smiled when they said it, but there was something else behind the smiles. Hunger, control, a smugness that assumed she'd say yes, because what else would a woman do? Clara remembered her husband's hands, the way he'd pulled her by the wrist when angry, how she'd learned not to flinch in front of others, only in private. She remembered the cracked tooth he'd given her, and the way the preacher had called it a burden she must bear with grace. She remembered thinking, I would rather die, and so she disappeared. Not to die, but to be forgotten, and for 27 years the world had obliged her. Until now. The next knock didn't come for another week, then another, the week after. Each time, more certain, someone had found her, or was looking, or thought they saw smoke curling where it shouldn't. She watched the ridgeline through a peephole so small she'd carved it with a hot nail, checking each morning for boot prints in the mud. Once, she found one, just one, deep and fresh, leading away. By the third visit, she decided she would move deeper. There was a cavern not half a mile from her current dugout, buried behind a thicket of old roots and a rock slide from years back. She hadn't gone there in decades, not since she first mapped the land like a badger, memorizing escape routes, but she remembered it, and she could build there again if she had to. She packed what little she had: 3 pots, her best knife, the flint, a sack of dried beans, a wool blanket, and a tobacco tin full of thread and nails. She left the axe out in plain view beside the hearth. A warning: she took nothing sentimental, no keepsakes, no mementos, except the one thing she couldn't leave behind: her journal. It wasn't a diary, it was a record of survival, scribbled notes on what plants boiled safe, when the river changed course, when frost came early, or squirrels disappeared. Each page a testament, not to her pain, but to her refusal. She kept it wrapped in oilcloth and tied with gutstring. By dusk, she was gone, but not far enough, because as she crossed the ridge, hunched and dragging her sack through brittle grass, she saw the smoke. Someone had lit a fire, not hers, and it wasn't on accident. Someone was waiting. And Clara May Branson, who hadn't spoken to a soul in nearly 3 decades, felt something rise in her chest that she hadn't felt since her wedding night. Dread. She dropped to her knees, heart thundering, and watched from the thorns. 2 men sitting by a fire, one of them laughing, and beside them a map unfolded on a flat stone, and on it, drawn in thick charcoal, was the shape of her dugout. They weren't lost, they were hunting, and Clara knew in her bones they wouldn't stop at a knock next time. She had 24 hours, maybe less, and she would not run again, not this time. Clara slid backward into the brush, her palms scraping the dry roots, her joints catching every movement like hinges left out in a winter storm. The firelight across the ridge flickered through the tangled grass, and though she could no longer see the men clearly, their voices drifted across the hollow. One was older, with a voice that rasped like boots over gravel. The other was younger, his tone sharper, more impatient. Clara didn't need to see their faces to know their kind. The West hadn't run out of men who saw a woman alone and thought her life was theirs to claim. She lay still, face pressed into the dirt, breathing through her shawl. The earth was cold, but she'd grown used to that long ago. She knew this land, this wind, this rhythm. They did not, and it gave her time. She crawled a 1/4 mile in darkness, guided by the slope and the weight of memory. The thorns clawed at her shawl, her old boots filled with icy runoff. Her sack caught once on a root, and she had to cut the strap to free it. By the time she reached the old stone shelf that marked the hidden cavern, her breath was raw in her throat and her fingers numb. The entrance was just as she remembered, half buried, half hidden by the same rock slide from years ago. She shoved her shoulder against the cold stones, dislodging enough to slip inside. Her body, thin as cordwood now, easily slid between cracks. Inside, it smelled of bats and dry mold, but it was dry, and it was hers. She sat against the back wall, sack beside her, listening. No one followed. Not yet. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lit no fire, struck no light. She simply sat, wrapped in the wool shawl, staring into the dark, her journal in her lap. In the old days, she might have waited them out, moved again, dug a new hole, gone deeper into the wild, but she was 61 now. Her knees groaned with every shift. Her left hand couldn't close fully anymore. The winters bit deeper, the thaw slower. She had enough beans to last weeks. But what then? No, this time she would not run. They had brought a map, which meant someone had spoken, or someone had sold a story. Maybe that old boy from town, now drunk and chatty. Maybe one of the wandering fur trappers who sometimes passed through the canyon and swore they saw smoke in a place smoke shouldn't be. It didn't matter. What mattered was this: someone had decided she was worth finding. And if they were men, if they came with the same purpose she'd escaped long ago, then they weren't here for land, or peace, or kindness. They'd want her silent, obedient, grateful. And Clara May Branson had buried those things with her husband's Bible the day she walked into the creek bed alone. At dawn, she returned, not to confront them, not yet. She needed to know who they were, how they thought, what they carried. The fire was dead, but the tracks were fresh, crushed into the half-frozen earth, heavy boot prints, not used to soft ground. She followed at a distance, watching from the ridgeline as they made their way down into the wash. They'd broken the lock on her dugout. She felt a sickness rise in her throat, but it wasn't fear, it was fury. Her home, 27 years of solitude, of careful living, of inch-by-inch survival, now violated by 2 men who believed the land and all upon it owed them welcome. From her perch, she watched them enter. They stood inside no more than 10 minutes. She could see them through the half-open door, heads bowed, poking through her things. One held up the wool blanket, the other tapped at the old iron pot with his boot. Then they both froze, and she knew what they'd found. The axe, left there like a sentinel. They didn't laugh this time, and when they stepped outside, their voices were hushed. "She's close," the older one said. "Real close." Still breathing too, the younger replied. No bones, no rot. She saw us. She's watching now. They both looked up. Clara ducked lower. She had seen enough. She backed away, heart pounding, slow and careful, as frost spreading on glass. Back in the cavern, she unpacked in silence. There would be no running. She'd lived through storm, flood, disease, and one winter so cold her teeth cracked in her sleep. She wasn't about to lose now, not to a pair of men with shiny boots and dirty smiles. She didn't think of it as planning, not in the military sense. She had no weapons save her knife and her wit, but Clara knew every bend in this land, every hollow and game trail, every weakness in the soil. She knew where water pooled and where it vanished. She knew the sound of shifting stone, and she knew how to trap a body, animal or otherwise, so it couldn't move again. That knowledge had been hard-earned. She left the cavern before dusk and set out, north toward the abandoned mining pit where the hill had once given way during the thaw of '77. It had collapsed halfway, but not fully. The shaft still breathed cold air, and beneath it was a hollow basin, just wide enough to lure something in and trap it if weighted right. She worked through the night, cutting dry limbs, weaving thorn vine, using her own scarf as a tether. She soaked brush with the last of her lard and scattered pine needles over the opening. The air was still, no wind to betray her movement. By the time the moon was overhead, she'd set 3 snares, 1 above the shaft, 2 near the old wagon trail, where they'd likely circle looking for her again. She didn't wait in the cavern this time. She waited in the branches above, wrapped in mud and silence. When they came again, they came loud. They called her name, not gently, not with remorse or inquiry, but with demand. Clara May Branson, the younger voice shouted it like he owned it. We know you're out here. She said nothing. They fanned out, rifles loose at their sides, and when the younger one stepped onto the false trail she'd marked in her own boot prints, the ground gave way just enough for him to twist his ankle and fall with a grunt. The older one spun, saw nothing, and drew his pistol. That's when she made the sound, like a rabbit scream, high, sharp, echoing across the basin. They both turned, and she disappeared again. The chase didn't last long. It wasn't meant to. She just needed them winded, separated, confused. By the time the older man circled back, the fire pit near her dugout was smoking again. She'd lit it herself with damp moss and old bark, making sure the smoke rose high, clear, bait-like. He walked straight into it, and she watched from the shadow behind the doorframe as he stepped inside, rifle cocked. When he turned his back, she kicked the door shut. The lock dropped, and she drove a timber beam through the handle. He shouted once, then silence. Inside, she heard the thump of him slamming against it. She took her time walking back toward the shaft, where the younger one was still limping, his ankles swelling. He saw her too late. She stepped into view with her knife held low, not threatening, just present. He froze, didn't raise his rifle, didn't even reach for it, just stared. "You've been hunting ghosts," she said, her voice dry from disuse. "You found one." He opened his mouth, but no words came. "Turn around," she said. "Go home. Forget this place." He did not move, so she took one step closer, slow. "I lived out here longer than you've been alive, boy. You think I'm scared of you?" His mouth worked, but again, no sound. "You don't want to be like the one in the hole," she said. He blinked. He's your husband?" She laughed once, short and bitter. "No." And that was all she said. She let him go, watched him limp across the ridge and vanish. Then she returned to the dugout. The older one was still inside. She opened the door slowly, knife in hand. He raised his rifle, but didn't fire. His hand was trembling. He hadn't expected her to be old. She stepped aside. He walked out, face pale, rifle lowered. She never said a word to him. Not a threat, not a name. And when he left, he didn't look back. That night she sat by the coals again. The pot hissed gently, filled with roots and water. Her axe rested beside her, and for the first time in years she opened her journal not to record the weather, but to write a letter, not to anyone living, just a name, her own, Clara May Branson, daughter of no one, wife of no man, ghost of the West, still here, still free. The thaw ended 2 days later. Spring arrived, not like a blossom, but like a warning, with high winds that screamed through the canyons and bent the cottonwoods sideways, as if trying to peel the land back open. Clara sat in the mouth of her dugout, with the wind howling outside, the coals of her fire low, the pot long since cooled. Her fingers were numb, not from cold, but from stillness. She hadn't moved in hours. She didn't need to. She had won. But victory, in the way of old women and hunted things, felt nothing like triumph. The younger man would never return. That much she believed. His ankle, even if not broken, would remind him every time he took a step, not just of her, but of what she meant, that a woman alone was not meat for wolves, that some cabins were built not for warmth, but for war. But the older older one. She hadn't let herself sleep since he left. The way he'd walked out, rifle lowered but still clenched, his face pale, but his eyes not scared, not truly. They'd burned with something she recognized too well. He would come back, not out of vengeance, but out of something worse. Curiosity. That's what frightened her. Curiosity had always been more dangerous than malice. Malice was predictable. Curiosity lingered. Curiosity made men ask questions. It made them circle, return, peel back layers until they felt they had solved something. Owned it. He would want to know why a woman would vanish into the earth for nearly 3 decades, and men who ask why never leave without trying to fix it. She began sealing up the old dugout the next morning, not for retreat, for finality. There would be no more hiding, but she wasn't about to leave a trail of breadcrumbs either. The front door, once thick with years of moss and dust, she removed entirely and carried half a mile into the woods before burying it beneath a blanket of stones. The chimney trap door she caved in with a log, watching the bricks tumble down like pieces of her past. The floor she scattered with pine needles soaked in creek water. The coals, buried, her journal, returned to its wrapping and hidden in a new place, a crevice beneath a boulder, sealed with sap and sealed again with dirt. She didn't know if she'd live another winter, but if she did, she would live it on her own terms. And if not, then she'd go down not as prey, but as something far older, far stranger, a tale. The signs came on the 3rd day. Boot prints again, 2 sets, one light, new, fast, the other, the same man as before. She recognized the pattern in the heel, but this time they weren't looking, they were waiting. Tracks led not toward her dugout, but to the rim above it. They had sat there, for hours. She could tell by the circles in the dust, the scraps of food left behind, the tin cup placed on a rock. They hadn't searched, they had watched. That night Clara climbed into the ridge herself, walking slow and silent beneath a waxing moon, her boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Her body ached with every step, but her nerves burned hot. She knew how to be invisible, but watching watchers, that was a different skill. She found them before they saw her, camped again, near Crooked Wash. 2 lean figures under a canvas tarp, fire low, voices calm. The younger man was different now, quieter, hunched. He held his ankle in his lap like it still pained him. The older man had grown more animated. He spoke in half sentences, leaning forward, gesturing with a knife at the map again. They built these things everywhere, he was saying, all up and down the plains. Dugouts, root cellars, survival holes. Women too, not just miners. The way she moved, she was trained. Not in books, in life. The younger one said nothing. She's been out here too long, the older man continued. That kind of time changes a person. Makes them mean, makes them dangerous. You gonna shoot her next time? The boy asked. A pause. The older man looked up. No, I want to talk. Clara exhaled so slowly it hurt. It was worse than she thought. He didn't want to kill her, not even rob her. He wanted to understand her, and maybe that was the true death. Because once someone thinks they understand you, they feel entitled to you, your reasons, your soul, the bones of what you are. She'd seen that with her husband. He'd come to believe her body was his reward for keeping the law, that her silence was proof of her virtue, that her obedience was love. She had escaped that once. She wouldn't escape it twice. She returned to the cavern with a fever in her limbs. It wasn't sickness, it was memory. All day she couldn't eat, couldn't drink. The soup she'd boiled tasted like ash. The bread she'd made from old cattail flour turned to paste in her mouth. Everything inside her said one thing: this wasn't over. That night she did something she hadn't done in 27 years. She lit a torch, wrapped it in pitch-soaked cloth, struck the flint, and walked through the narrow pass east of her cavern, the one that led into the ravine where her first mule had died. Years back, crushed beneath a falling tree. She passed the old bones, still there, still white as bleached stone. She was looking for something, not safety, not escape, a place to end it if it came to that, a place she could hold. She found it in the rocks, a narrow corridor, one way in, one way out, high ground above, thorn bushes already half grown. She could make a stand here. If needed, she wouldn't run again. She would not hide again. The next morning, they knocked. Again, no fire, no shouting, just a single knock on the old dugout door. Clara wasn't there, but she watched. From above, through a slitted tree hollow she'd carved days ago. They didn't try the door this time. The older man stood still, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he said, loud but not crude. "My name's Eli Turner. I'm not here to hurt you. I heard about you from someone in town. Said you were a legend, a myth." He paused. "I don't believe in myths." The younger one stood behind him, arms crossed. "I want to ask you something, ma'am," Turner continued. "If you're really out here, and you're really alone," he swallowed, "I want to know why. silence. Then he turned, slowly, and left. They didn't camp nearby this time. They vanished. Clara stayed in the tree 2 more hours. Then she descended and opened the dugout for the first time in days. Inside was quiet, safe, but she could feel it. Something had changed. Not in them, in her. That night, Clara opened her journal again. She wrote not about the weather, nor the prince, nor the traps. She wrote, "I remember now. The first time I buried my voice. It was in the church, when the pastor asked me if I would love and obey. I said yes, but inside I was screaming." She turned the page. "I've built a life in silence, but silence is not safety. It is just another man's shape, worn like a shroud." Another line. "He wants to know why I live alone. I think the better question is, why do so many women not?" She didn't sleep. She sat by the low coals and sharpened her knife, not in fear, but in ritual, as if to remind herself she still could. And when the next knock came, it was not on the door. It was on the rock above the cavern, a small, sharp rapping. She climbed out slowly. There, placed atop the stone, was a tin cup. Inside it, 3 acorns, and a note, scrawled on the back of the map they'd once held. "We've gone, for good, but the world will come again. Be ready, E.T." Clara stared at it for a long time, then burned it. She didn't return to the dugout, not because she feared they'd return, but because she didn't need it anymore. The land was hers, not as a hiding place, but as a kingdom. Her silence wasn't exile, it was dominion, and she had ruled it alone, unchallenged, unbroken. She dug a new shelter higher up, where the wind screamed louder and the birds cried in pairs. She grew old there, slower now, but not weaker, just quieter. And when she passed, years later, no one found her. Only the journal remained, wrapped in oilcloth, placed in the hollow of the stone, and on its last page, "Let them call me myth. Let them ask why I stayed hidden. Let them dig through the dirt of my memory looking for answers they'll never understand. Because they never asked why I left in the first place." The high shelter wasn't beautiful. It wasn't grand or new. It wasn't made to impress or to welcome or even to endure forever. It was carved in haste by hands that had learned over decades how the soil bent, how the roots coiled, how stone would split under just the right pressure if your blade was sharp and your grip was patient. Clara's new shelter was dug into the ridge like a wound, cut narrow and deep, just enough to keep her dry and warm and hidden. The door was no door at all, just bark pressed between stones, daubed with clay and sap. The roof didn't rise, it hunched, and Clara, now 62 and thinner than she'd ever been, moved through it like a shade, like something the mountain itself had birthed from silence. But for the first time since she'd dug her very first hole, she didn't build it for hiding, she built it for staying. The old dugout she'd sealed was gone, erased by brush and by time. The men were gone too, she believed that, but their presence had done something she hadn't expected. It reminded her of her own story, not in bitterness, not in fear, but in clarity. Clara May Branson hadn't disappeared. She had lived, and the living had been loud in its own way. Louder than any preacher's sermon, louder than any rifle crack or gossiping tongue in town. Her survival wasn't a whisper in the dark. It was a roar, even if only she had heard it. Now, in this new hollow above the bluff, she finally let herself sit still and listen to birdsong, to meltwater, to the quiet click of beetles in the pine bark, to the way wind combed the grass like fingers through a child's hair. She listened to all of it and began at last to speak again, if only in murmurs, to herself. It started with simple things. She whispered memories aloud, as though recounting them to a visitor who never came. Sometimes it was the smell of spring onions in the frost. Sometimes it was the shape of her mother's hands, or the rasp of her father's voice when he sharpened the spade. Other times, she spoke directly to the dead, not just her husband, he didn't deserve the breath, but others, the woman who once pulled her from a flood when she was a child, the neighbor girl who had been kind when no one else was, even the baby she'd lost one winter and never spoken of, not even to the journal. She gave them words, gave them air, and in doing so, gave herself back a voice. One night a storm rolled in fast, like they sometimes did in the highlands, with black clouds that seemed to growl before they struck, and cold winds that howled down the canyon like wolves. Clara had just enough time to seal the entrance with bark and brace the supports. Rain hit the roof like stones. The walls groaned, and in the center of that storm, she did something that would have seemed unthinkable in her early years. She laughed, not because anything was funny, but because she was still here. The whole world could beat against her roof, claw at her walls, try to wash her away like she didn't belong, and it wouldn't matter. She had built herself too deep. Months passed. Clara kept living. She learned to grind acorns into a coarse meal that, when boiled long enough, turned into something like porridge. She trapped again. Not for fur, not anymore, but for meat. She didn't waste anything. Bone, marrow, sinew. She smoked and dried and stored what she could. She found new springs that ran clear and marked them with stones. She discovered a plant, tiny, with soft leaves, that soothed her joints when steeped and drank hot. She didn't keep track of days anymore, but her body remembered the rhythm of seasons, and she followed it. And though no one came again, not for many years, she began preparing for the day someone might. It was on a clear morning in her 66th year when she saw the first child. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't seen footprints in weeks, maybe longer. She'd long ago abandoned her watch over the old trails, but she was walking along the ridge, basket in hand, gathering bark and tender root, when she saw a figure, small, slow-moving, dirty, with knees bleeding and clothes torn, stumbling through the underbrush below. A girl, no older than 10, maybe younger, hair matted, eyes wide. Clara froze. So did the child. They stared at each other for a long moment, two animals recognizing something in one another that neither had language for. Then the girl bolted. Clara didn't chase her. She didn't call out. She watched where she ran, toward the low trail, past the bone-white tree near the ravine. Later that evening, she found where the girl had camped, a pile of leaves, scraps of cloth, a bundle of cattails not yet dry. No fire, no food. Clara stood in silence for nearly an hour before leaving behind a half-loaf of pressed bark cake and a handful of dried berries. She didn't expect it to be taken, but it was. The next day, it was gone. And in its place, a single pine cone, stripped of its seeds and placed carefully on a flat stone. A gift, a thank you, or maybe something older, a sign. They met again 4 days later, when Clara came to the spring at dawn and found the girl crouched there, cupping water to her mouth. She didn't run this time. She didn't speak either. She just watched as Clara knelt across from her, dipped her own hands into the water and drank. The girl was thin, too thin. Her ribs showed. Her hands were chapped raw. Clara said nothing, just pulled a packet of pressed root from her satchel and placed it on the stone between them. The girl took it without a word. They sat together in silence until the sun rose. Then the girl vanished into the brush, but not before looking back. Once. Just once. She came again and again, not every day, not even every week, but enough. Clara never asked where she came from, never asked her name, never pressed. She recognized the shape of a soul that had been run too hard, too far, for too long. Instead, she offered food, then warmth, then, after the second snow, a place to sleep, just once, by the embers, inside the hollow. The girl said no at first, but eventually, she said yes. And once she had slept there, curled on the dirt floor, wrapped in Clara's spare wool, she returned more often. They began to speak, slowly, in pieces, like bones reassembled. Her name was Naomi. She didn't say why she'd run. Clara didn't ask, but she knew. Some things don't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. That winter they survived together. And for the first time in 27 years, Clara didn't do it alone. She taught Naomi how to wrap her boots in bark to keep dry, how to seal a door with snow, how to find dry twigs even in sleet. Naomi taught Clara how to laugh again, not like a memory, but like a present thing, sudden and strange and alive. They didn't speak much about the world. They didn't need to. The ridge was their world now, and it was enough. But peace never lasts forever, and it was the girl who saw them first. Two riders, far off, crossing the bend below the bluff. No fire, no camp, just a slow patrol, men in coats too clean for hunters, eyes too sharp for drifters. Naomi went pale. "They're looking," she said. Clara didn't ask who, she just nodded and began packing, not to run, not this time, to prepare. They reinforced the shelter, dug out the old escape tunnel she hadn't touched in 10 years, stocked it with dry bread, flint, water. Clara handed Naomi the journal, wrapped in fresh oilcloth. "If anything happens," she said, "you take this, and you go." Naomi didn't argue. She understood, because the world was still the same, and some men still didn't understand why a woman might disappear, or why she might fight to stay that way. The men never made it up the ridge. The snow came early that year, covered their tracks, washed them back down into the lowlands. They never returned, but Clara didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because she knew now there would always be more men, more questions, more reasons to explain herself, and she was done explaining. That spring, Naomi left, not forever, just long enough to see what lay beyond the canyon. Clara gave her a bag of dried meat, a blade, and a piece of hide with symbols scratched in pine soot, her own map of the mountains. Naomi hugged her, tight. Neither of them cried. But when Naomi stepped into the trees, Clara placed her hand to the earth and whispered a prayer. Not the kind the preacher had once taught her, but the kind the wind had whispered into her blood during the hard years. A prayer for silence, for strength, for return. The high shelter remained quiet for many years after that. Clara grew older, slower, her eyes dimmed, Her hands shook, but her mind never left her. She wrote more, spoke less, watched the world from behind bark and stone. And when she felt her time coming, she lay down, not in fear, but in stillness, not as a woman who had been forgotten, but as one who had chosen to be unclaimed, unbroken, a root in the earth, a shadow in the trees, a name written not in church records or gravestones, but in the cracks of stone and the curve of rivers. They did not find her bones. When Naomi returned, older now, shoulders broader, eyes lined with the thin hardness of someone who had tasted the world and chosen carefully what pieces to keep, she found the high ridge just as she remembered it, the bark entrance sealed, the brush grown tall, the wind moaning through the hollow with that same long morning whistle it always had. She called once. Clara? No answer, not even an echo. She didn't panic, she didn't rush. She'd come back not out of desperation or fear, but out of promise, a promise made in silence, in firelight, when two women had shared the kind of truth that never needed naming, a promise to return, to carry forward. The door was sealed with sap and stone. Naomi dug through it gently, respectfully. Inside, it was dry, undisturbed. The coals in the hearth were long dead. The pot was empty, scrubbed clean. The wool Clara had once wrapped around her thin frame was folded neatly on the cot. But Clara herself, Clara was gone, not fled, not vanished in fright, gone like smoke that rises, like something finished. Naomi found the last pages of the journal, hidden behind a stone slab beneath the hearth, not buried, placed, waiting. She read them slowly, her fingers trembling, tracing each word like it was breath still warm. I did not go quiet. I went alone, and in that aloneness I heard more than the world ever dared to speak. They'll wonder, perhaps, how I lasted this long. They always do, as though survival were a miracle, not a decision. Tell them, tell the next girl, that silence is not surrender. It is space, and what grows in it can outlast stone. The final line was dated the previous winter. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Naomi folded the pages back inside their oilcloth, wrapped them tightly, and held them to her chest as she sat on the cold dirt floor of that narrow shelter, the same place she'd once warmed her young fingers on Clara's coals, long ago. She stayed for 3 days, didn't speak once, didn't try to find remains. There wouldn't be any. Clara May Branson had lived in the mountain the way trees lived, dying only when they chose, and even then, never really gone. Just part of the ground now, part of the silence. Naomi left the shelter intact. She resealed the door. She reinforced the roof. She swept the floor with a pine branch, smoothed the bedroll, and placed a fresh bundle of dried meat and cattail starch in the corner where Clara used to keep food for hard days. Then she left the journal, wrapped, dry and clean, beneath the hearthstone again. But before she slid the stone shut, she added something of her own. Not a message, not a name, just a piece of cloth, torn from the same shawl Clara had once wrapped her in. A mark, a trace, a seed. Years passed, the ridge changed, trees fell, new brush rose, the trail thinned until even deer barely passed that way. But sometimes, during late spring thaws, hunters or trappers would swear they saw a figure moving up on the high rocks, too small for a man, too swift for a bear, wrapped in wool, carrying something like a basket, or a book, or just a shape they couldn't explain. A few came searching, most turned back. Too steep, they said, too quiet. Once one man found the shelter. He didn't enter, said it felt like a grave, even though it was clean, said he heard whispering, no words, just breath, like the wind had learned how to speak. He left a tin of matches by the door and told no one where he'd been. But stories grow, especially when rooted in silence, and over time, the legend spread. They said a woman had once lived alone up there for nearly 30 years, and no man could catch her, claim her, or even find her when she didn't want to be seen. They said she was a witch, a hermit, a murderess who'd hidden after killing her husband. They said she could vanish into trees, speak to the mountain, trap wolves with one hand. They said she was a ghost. But those who knew, those who had felt the fire of her defiance, who had read her words or sat in her shadow, they never corrected the stories. They just listened and smiled, because truth doesn't need loudness, only roots. Naomi carried the journal south to a place where the air was warm and the rivers never froze. She lived a life half in shadow, never speaking of her childhood, never explaining why she flinched when men raised their voices, or why she built her home into the ground rather than above it. But she survived, and when her first daughter was born, she wrapped her in the same shawl and whispered her a story, not of princesses or fairies, but of a woman who had once dug her freedom into the side of a canyon and dared the world to take it from her. A woman who hadn't just lived, but outlived. The journal was passed down, not like a treasure, like a tool. Each woman who held it added one line, no more, a sentence, a breath, a thread in a tapestry no man ever read. One day, generations later, it would be found again by another girl, another silence, another fire. She'll open it and read not a history, but a memory, one that feels like her own, because it is, because silence, when chosen, becomes voice, because hidden places don't always mean fear. Sometimes they mean freedom, sometimes they mean enough. And Clara, she remains, in the moss, in the roots, in the ridge no one dares claim. Not as a ghost, not as a tale, but as a truth, buried and blooming.